Tower of London is famous for its ghosts. Most people know the big names before they ever step through the gates. Anne Boleyn, said to walk near the chapel after her execution. The two young princes, remembered in one of England's darkest royal mysteries. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, forever tied to the blood-soaked history of Tower Green. These are the stories that appear in guidebooks, documentaries, and late-night ghost tours. But they are not the only hauntings said to belong to the tower. The strange thing about a place like this is that history does not only belong to queens, kings, and prisoners with famous names. For almost 1,000 years, the tower was also a workplace, a military stronghold, a home, a storehouse, a prison, and a place where ordinary people lived under extraordinary pressure. Guards stood watch through freezing nights. Servants carried food through dark passages. Builders repaired walls that had already seen centuries of fear. And some of the stories attached to the tower are not about royal ghosts at all. They are about the people history barely remembers. This video is the first in a 2-part mini-series. This episode looks at the lesser-known ghosts, strange sounds, cold rooms, shadowed staircases, and forgotten reports linked to the Tower of London. Some come from old folklore, some come from staff accounts and local tradition. Others are harder to prove, but they all point to the same unsettling idea, that the tower's most famous ghosts may not be the only ones still there after the gates close. It is worth remembering what the tower really was for most of the people who passed through it. It was a working fortress, and like every working place, it had people whose names were rarely written down unless something went wrong. The stone had to be repaired, gates had to be watched, food had to be prepared, fires had to be kept burning, prisoners had to be guarded, messages carried, rooms cleaned, stores checked, and orders followed. The tower depended on ordinary hands, and those hands belonged to people who lived close to danger every day. That is why some of the lesser-known ghost stories feel different. And in many ways, that makes them more unsettling, because they feel less like legends built for tourists, and more like memories the building has never quite released. Coldharbour Gate was once part of the tower's inner defences, built in the late 1230s during the reign of Henry III, when the fortress was being strengthened around the royal palace at its centre. Like so many parts of the tower, Coldharbour Gate changed over time. It later served as a prison, and one of the strangest stories connected to it comes from 1533, when Alice Tankerville, accused of piracy, escaped with help from a tower servant who had fallen in love with her. It is one of those details that almost feels too dramatic to belong to real history, but the tower is full of moments like that, where official records suddenly open a small window onto fear, risk, and human weakness behind the stone walls. The gatehouse itself was demolished in the 17th century. Then, during the Second World War, bomb damage in 1940 exposed sections of the innermost ward wall again. The haunting connected with Coldharbour Gate is not usually told as a grand apparition or a full-bodied figure walking across the stones. Some versions of the story speak of a tapping sound heard near the ruined wall after dark, when the tower has closed and the crowds have gone. It is said to be a dull, repeated knocking, the kind of sound that makes a person stop for a moment, because it seems to come from somewhere close by, even when no one is working there. They say a carpenter died there hundreds of years ago, and that he's still working on something unfinished. In the early 1500s, the tower was always under repair. Damp air from the river rotted the wood faster than the stone could hold it. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and masons came and went with the seasons. One of them was a young apprentice. He was said to be a good worker, quick with a hammer, confident for his age, and proud to be part of the king's fortress. During a routine job near the outer wall, he was replacing a beam that supported a storage frame by the old gate foundations. It was late in the day, the light fading, the kind of tired hour when men rush to finish before dark. The rope holding the frame above him snapped. The beam dropped instantly. They found what was left of him, crushed under the weight. The other workers buried what they could of him near the wall, covered the grave and moved on. The tower didn't stop for death, not for workers anyway. For years, that area remained quiet. Then wardens began reporting a faint, steady tapping late at night, always in threes, like a hammer on wood. Sometimes it came from the stones, sometimes from the ground. The sound stopped the moment anyone spoke. When they searched, there was nothing there. In the 1800s, a yeoman warder walking the grounds near Coldharbour Gate after midnight said his lantern began to sway on its own. He described the feeling as though someone was standing right beside him. Then he heard it. 3 sharp taps close enough that he felt the vibration. The following night, he brought another guard with him. They both searched the area, but could find no source for the noise. Nearly 4 centuries after his death, 2 maintenance workers in the early 1970s were sent to inspect the Coldharbour Gate site. The area was being stabilised as part of restoration work. The men were checking old stone supports near the base of the wall when one of them froze halfway up his ladder. He swore he felt a firm hand grip his shoulder. Thinking it was his mate, he turned to speak. No one was there. The other worker was across the site, out of reach. A second later, his toolbox tipped over by itself, spilling nails and a hammer across the ground. The site was cleared later that week, but the sound of hammering didn't stop. Modern staff sometimes report hearing movement down there when it rains. The sound carries through the stone like someone working under the surface. A few have even claimed to see a dim blue light, shaped roughly like a man bent over his work. One former night warden said he'd grown used to it. "You don't go looking for it," he said. "You just nod and keep walking." Whatever's left of the carpenter seems to be still on the job, hammering, fixing, or maybe just trapped in the last task he ever started. No one's sure what he's building down there. Today, Coldharbour Gate stands as a broken fragment of the tower's past. Easy to overlook, but difficult to forget once you know its story. It was built to defend, later used to imprison, torn down, concealed, and then brought back into sight by wartime damage. And according to the old stories, when the light fades and the tower grows quiet, there may still be a faint tapping near the stones, as though someone, somewhere inside the ruin, is still working in the dark. Byward Tower is not only one of the oldest parts of the tower, but one of the first parts of the Tower of London that many visitors pass through, though most are thinking about what lies beyond it rather than the gatehouse itself. It stands near the main entrance, with stone walls, narrow passages, and an old defensive purpose that is easy to miss when the place is busy. During the day, it feels like part of the visitor route, another historic threshold on the way into the tower. But after closing, when the crowds have gone, Byward Tower has a different feeling altogether. This was never just an entrance. It was a controlled way into a fortress, a place where people were watched as they came and went. Guards would have stood here in all weather, listening for movement, checking who had permission to pass, and making sure the outer world did not simply walk into the king's stronghold. Over the centuries, thousands of people must have crossed this point, from soldiers and servants to prisoners, officials, tradesmen, and families waiting for news from inside. They say a woman's voice can sometimes be heard there, quiet and tired, and calling a name no one recognizes. The story goes back to the late 1500s. The tower wasn't just a prison then. People lived and worked inside it. There were kitchens, stores, and bakeries that kept food moving between soldiers, servants, and prisoners. One of the men who worked in the Tower bakery fell ill during a bad summer. Some say it was a plague. Others said it was fever brought in from the river barges. His wife, a woman from the city, came each day to bring him bread and water, waiting at the gate near Byward Tower. But once the illness spread, the guards sealed the doors. No one was allowed in or out. The woman came anyway. Every night she waited near the stairwell, holding a basket, hoping someone would bring her news. No one did. When the sickness reached her husband, the tower's bell rang once at midnight to mark another death. The next morning, the woman was found slumped against the wall near the steps. She died there alone, still holding the basket. Her body was taken away quietly before the gates reopened. For years afterward, wardens and sentries said they saw movement by that same stairwell, a faint glow in the fog, always shaped like a woman. One described seeing her walking up the stairs, her head bent as if she was still listening for someone's voice. In the early 1900s, a guard reported the smell of warm bread drifting through the stairwell during a night patrol. He followed it to the upper landing, but found nothing. He later said the air turned cold so quickly that frost formed on the railing. His lamp went out by itself, and in the silence, he heard soft weeping echo down the steps. Others noticed small things. Flour appeared on the stone floor when no one had used the kitchen. Handprints on the wall from white like dust, possibly flour. Sometimes guards found the scent of smoke or felt heat as if an oven door had just been opened nearby, though there hadn't been a fire in that part of the tower for hundreds of years. No one talks about the stairwell much now. The tower's tours pass close to it, but the public can't go inside. The staff say it's best to leave it that way. One yeoman warden, now retired, once said that every few months, when he locked the gates for the night, he'd hear a quiet sound coming from the steps. A woman's voice, soft and distant, as if calling out a name. Byward Tower was built to control who entered and who left. But in this tale, the most haunting figure is someone who could do neither. She could not go in, could not bring help, and could not make the tower give her the answer she needed. So the story leaves her, where grief often leaves people, fixed to the last place they waited. And according to the old tradition, when Byward Tower grows quiet and the stairs empty for the night, she may still be there, listening for footsteps, carrying the memory of warm bread through the cold stone, and calling softly for someone who never comes. The Bloody Tower already carries one of the darkest names inside the Tower of London. Most visitors know it because of the princes in the tower, the two boys who vanished in 1483 and became part of one of England's most disturbing royal mysteries. Because of that, the tower has never needed much help to feel unsettling. Its reputation was fixed long ago, and even in daylight, the name alone changes the way people look at it. But not every strange story connected to the Bloody Tower is about the princes. There are other reports attached to the lower parts of the building, especially around the narrow passages and old stonework. The tower's wardens will tell you there's something else down there. Beneath the Bloody Tower is a narrow corridor that connects to the lower ward. The walls are lined with rough stone, some marked with old carvings and faint gouges that don't look like tools made them. The earliest mention of the passage comes from a 15th century record describing a noise from the stone. It was dismissed as rats or shifting mortar, but over the years that explanation didn't hold. Guards kept hearing scratching, faint at first, like fingernails on wood, then louder, sharper, as if someone was trapped behind the wall, trying to claw their way out. An old story claims that a mason was entombed alive during construction after being caught stealing from the armory. There's no proof, but the legend stuck. Some say the scratching started the same week his disappearance was recorded. In the 1800s, a night warden reported hearing the sound while making his rounds. He said it came from the wall near the old iron door. When he pressed his ear to the stone, it stopped. Moments later, he heard it again directly behind him, higher up the passage. In the 1920s, a new electric light system was installed in that passage. The workers reported hearing tapping and scraping from behind the wall each night when they finished for the day. One man joked that the tower didn't like being modernized. On the third evening, one of their lamps shattered for no reason, cutting the room into darkness. When they brought the light back, they found a new crack running down the wall. Modern staff rarely go down there alone. Even today, wardens say the sound still happens, always from the same stretch of wall. Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes frantic, like nails dragging on concrete. The stonework's been replaced in parts, but the noise hasn't stopped. The current yeoman guards keep that corridor locked after dark. Officially, it's to protect the old structure, but those who've worked there a long time tell a different story. They say the scratching doesn't come from rats or shifting stone. It comes from inside the wall itself. When they do maintenance now, they leave the lights on, even if no one's working. The sound doesn't like the light, they say. But every so often, when someone passes through at night, they hear it again. That steady, patient scratching, following their footsteps. No one knows what it wants, or if it's trying to get out. But whatever's behind that wall has been trying for over 500 years and still hasn't stopped. And when the tower closes for the night, when the famous stories fall silent and the lower passages grow cold, that is when the old wall is said to speak again. Not with words, and not with a voice anyone can answer, but with the faint sound of something still scratching in the dark. The Salt Tower sits along the inner wall of the Tower of London, looking out toward the river. The tower dates back to the 13th century and has served different purposes over its long life. It has been used for storage, defense, and imprisonment, and some of its prisoners left carvings on the walls. The names and marks cut into stone are different from ordinary history. They remind you that people were not just held here as names in a record, but as living human beings with time, fear, anger, and loneliness pressing in on them. One record mentions a weeping heard nightly within the upper chamber. The entry ends with a note that the sound stopped when the room was sealed. In the 1600s, during renovations, a mason found a hidden cavity behind one of the walls. Inside was a small wooden bench and a chain fixed to the stone. Nothing else. The chamber was resealed after inspection. Not long after, the night watch reported a strange sound moving through the tower. A long, low moan that rose and fell like someone struggling to breathe. Every few decades, the same thing happened again. Sometimes it was described as wind, other times as a voice. A yeoman warder in the 1890s wrote that the sound made his chest tighten. He compared it to a dying man drawing air through wet cloth. Another account from the early 1900s described it as a deep sigh that travels from one wall to another with no source found. In the 1950s, when the tower was being rewired for electricity, 2 engineers stayed late one night to finish work in the upper chamber. Around midnight, they both heard the same long, uneven sound coming from the floor. Thinking it was an air leak, they checked the ducts, but there were none. Then the noise rose again, louder, as though coming from inside the wall. One of them felt a faint vibration through the stone, like something pressing back. Both men left without collecting their tools. When the site was reopened the next morning, the tools were still there, but the air in the room was freezing, colder than anywhere else in the building. Condensation covered the walls, even though the rest of the tower was dry. The temperature returned to normal after the tools were removed. The Salt Tower remains one of those places where the haunting is difficult to separate from the atmosphere. The stone, the carvings, the silence, the river air, and the memory of confinement all work together. Even before anyone speaks of ghosts, the tower already feels as though it is holding something in. And according to the old tales, when the tower grows quiet and the wind moves through the ancient walls, Salt Tower sometimes gives that something back. Not as a face, and not as a voice, but as a long, low breath in the stone, as if someone unseen is still trying to draw air from a room that never quite let them go. The Queen's House is one of the more unusual buildings inside the Tower of London, partly because it does not have the same hard, fortress-like appearance as the towers around it. It stands near Tower Green, close to the place where some of the tower's most famous prisoners met their final moments, and because of that, it is very easy for the building to be pulled into the better-known ghost stories. But there is another story attached to the Queen's House, one that does not belong to a queen at all. The story starts around 1536, the year Anne Boleyn was held and executed. The Queen's House was new then, built for royal use and lodging senior officers. One of the servants assigned there was a young maid. She was known for keeping to herself, polite, careful, and soft-spoken. She worked under the housekeeper, tending fires and cleaning the hallways. When Queen Anne was brought to the tower, the maid was seen often near the stairwell that led to her quarters. Records show she carried trays and linens to the guards outside the Queen's room. But one morning, she didn't appear for duty. Her belongings were still in her small room, and the other servants said they heard something during the night. A sharp cry followed by the sound of someone running down the stairs. A search was made of the Queen's house and the surrounding grounds. They found nothing, no body, no sign of struggle. The official record lists her as departed without leave, but those who lived there said otherwise. They said she never left. Soon after, the guards on night watch began to report seeing a woman walking across the courtyard between the Queen's house and the scaffold site, always at the same time, just before dawn. She wore a blue gown that shimmered faintly even in low light. When they called out, she vanished. In later years, staff described hearing light footsteps on the wooden floors at night, even when the building was locked. One officer in the 1800s said he followed the sound up the staircase and saw the shape of a woman standing at the landing, one hand on the banister, head tilted as if listening. Her dress was a dull, faded blue. He said the air around her smelled faintly of smoke and soap, like the servants' quarters. She disappeared before he reached her. During the Second World War, when the tower was partly evacuated, a warden reported seeing a figure in blue moving past the windows of the Queen's house at dusk. He thought it was a trespasser until he realized the reflection showed no face. The yeoman warders have a saying, "She walks when the lights dim." No one knows what happened to her. There are no burial records, and her name isn't listed among those released from service. But the blue figure still appears now and then, crossing the courtyard as if finishing one last errand that was interrupted centuries ago. During the day, the tower is full of noise. Visitors move through the courtyards, guides speak to groups, cameras click, footsteps echo, and the city continues around the walls. In that kind of atmosphere, the tower can feel busy, almost ordinary in places. But after closing, when the gates are shut and the crowds have gone, the sound changes completely. The fortress becomes wider, colder, and strangely hollow. Every footstep seems to travel further than it should, and every small noise has space to grow. Inside the White Tower, stories have also grown around strange vibrations and low humming sounds when rooms are supposed to be empty. These are the sort of reports that could easily come from the age of the building, from distant traffic, or from the way stone and timber respond to temperature. Yet the people who describe them often say the same thing. The sound did not feel like background noise. It felt as if it had entered the room with them. That is the uncomfortable part of the tower at night. A faint scrape from above, a footstep behind a locked door, or a soft metallic sound in a place where no one should be moving is enough to make the whole building feel occupied. There is an old idea that some places remember what happened inside them, not in a neat or magical way, but through atmosphere, repetition, and the way people keep telling the same kinds of stories. The tower has heard nearly 1,000 years of orders, keys, boots, prayers, arguments, work, fear, and waiting. Even without ghosts, it would be strange if a place like that ever felt completely silent. That may be why the unexplained sounds of the tower are so effective. They do not ask you to believe in a single ghost. They ask a much more difficult question. What if a place can become so full of human experience that it never quite empties out? Wakefield Tower stands close to the riverside of the Tower of London. It was built in the 13th century, and over the centuries it became part of the tower's inner life, a place shaped by royal power, military duty, and the daily routines of those who worked within the walls. During the day, it is part of the visitor route, another historic tower among many, but the story attached to Wakefield Tower belongs more naturally to the hours after closing. It's here, more than anywhere else, that the guards still talk about seeing someone who shouldn't be there. The story of the century has been around for as long as anyone can remember. The earliest written account dates to the 1860s, when a yeoman warden on patrol reported seeing a man in uniform standing motionless by the tower entrance late at night. The figure was described as tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an older style of guard's tunic. When approached, the figure didn't move, and then, without a sound, vanished. In 1915, a guard on duty near Wakefield heard footsteps pacing behind him. He turned and saw the outline of another sentry in full dress, pacing the same path he was on. When he tried to speak, the figure stopped, turned its head, and slowly lifted a pike to its shoulder before fading into the dark. During the 1940s, soldiers stationed in the tower reported the same apparition. One recalled waking up in the barracks to the sound of boots on the stone floor outside. Thinking it was a patrol change, he looked through the window and saw a lone figure walking along the river wall in the fog. The same tunic, the same steady march. The footsteps echoed even after the figure disappeared. In the 1960s, a yeoman warder and a police constable patrolling together heard the distinct sound of a sword being drawn from its sheath. They found nothing but a faint metallic ring echoing through the corridor. Later that same week, another warden said he saw a reflection of a man in armor in one of the display cases, though no one was standing behind him. The story never gives a clear answer about who the sentry might have been. That may be part of why it works. He is not remembered as a named officer, a famous prisoner, or anyone important enough to be written into the larger history of the tower. He is simply a guard, and that is enough. The tower was full of people like that, men whose names disappeared, but whose duties helped keep the fortress running year after year. These stories are not the grand legends most visitors come looking for. They are smaller, stranger, and harder to place. Some may be folklore. Some may be old staff stories passed from one person to another. But that is the thing about the tower. It has never only belonged to kings, queens, and famous prisoners. It also belonged to the people who worked there and disappeared from history almost completely. Their names may be gone, but the stories remain. And when the gates close and the last visitors leave, it looks like the tower does not fall silent at all. It simply returns to the older sounds beneath the surface, the ones most people never stay long enough to hear. In the second and final part of this Tower of London miniseries, we will turn to the ghosts that made the tower famous, from royal figures and vanished princes to the legends that still draw people back to these walls. But for now, it is worth remembering the ones history nearly forgot.